Hello, welcome to Postcolonial Space. Those of you who don't know me, I'm Masood Raja, and today's topic I chose was Can Literature Teach Empathy? And the reason I chose this topic, of course, was because, you go with what you know and what your expertise is. So studying empathetic behavior is kind of part of my training, especially when it relates to literature. So I thought I should have a conversation with you all, um, and hence this topic. So as you all know, the comments are open, and so the best way to learn from each other is if you post some questions and I'll try to address them. But I mean, primarily, first of all, what we need to understand is what do we mean by empathy, right? Because we usually conflate empathy with sympathy. The difference, and it's a very important difference, is that empathy involves understanding the feelings and suffering and plight of the other from their point of view, right? The capacity to step into their framework, their structures of experience, and then experience it from there. Sympathy can be sometimes paternalistic, right? You can be like living in very comfortable environments and still feel sympathetic for others. But that's the subtle difference between empathy. The empathy enables us to look at the feelings of our local and global others from the point of view of their experience. And that's the crucial point. Now, while literature, I don't know where are all you joining from, but majority of the humanists, people who teach literature, excuse me, in the United States automatically assume that what we do in our classes or that simply reading a good book or a good novel makes us better, compassionate people. But no one really explains how, right? And that how can we formally attend to it in a classroom? So that's what we are going to explore. So let me welcome LearnPlex from India, Amina, and of course, Lisa. And those of you who are joining in, please let us know where are you joining in. But thank you and welcome. Now, these webinars are, a regular feature. I hope to do them every Saturday. They are 10 a.m., of course, U.S. Central Time, which is 8 p.m. Pakistan Standard Time, and I think it should be 7:30 p.m. Indian Standard Time, but I could be wrong. And Lisa, I don't know what time is it in UK, but I think you're 7 hours ahead of us, so that's where you are. Okay, Farouk, thank you. Welcome. So Farouk is from Kent State, and of course, that's where my mentor and friend Mark Bracker teaches, and he's the one I learned most of these things from. Actually, I have in my hand one of the books that I had edited, which is Critical Pedagogy, and in that, Mark Bracker had contributed an essay where he builds on his previous work. So Mark Bracker is a scholar of social justice pedagogy, but also a scholar of the kind of pedagogy that uses studies of consciousness, psychoanalysis, studies of brain to theorize and formulate modes of teaching within the American context, humanities, in a way that people who study or read literature can become empathetic human beings and are compassionate towards their global and local others, especially if there is a class difference. So that's what he theorizes on. Most of my work is, of course, informed by his research. Now, can literature teach empathy? Of course, I mean, it can. But can simply reading literature or experiencing art do that? That's the big question, right? Because if we assume that simply by reading a good book or watching a good movie, we can become better human beings and be compassionate, then my job is done, your job is done, right? Okay, San, thank you. So it's 8:30 p.m. in India. Cool, good to know. And it's gratifying to know that people are joining me on their weekend, from such far-flung places. Also, going back to the question, can literature do that by itself? I mean, my answer personally is no. And you can put it within the context of your own education as well. If understanding complex texts, knowing good English or good French, if these things are valorized in a culture, like in India and Pakistan, for example, then what ends up happening is that people who know more and who can quote Shakespeare and Middleton and John Donne, besides mastering these texts and learning how to quote them, they also develop a sense of superiority over those who cannot do that. And you can tell me if I'm wrong. In American Academy, we have seen amongst our own graduate students is that when they learn a few things here and there, they also pick up this a sort of disdainful attitude for people who may not be humanist, who may not be able to appreciate literature. So technically speaking, if we are not steered correctly by our mentors and professors and colleagues, studying literature can sort of make us into snobs or can make us into people who, might think of themselves as, better than others. Now, can it still inform us about the world around us? Yes. So, Mark Brocker, whom I mentioned previously, he has a wonderful book called Radical Pedagogy, and I have a full lecture on radical pedagogy, which you can watch in your own time. I will post a link to it in the description to this webinar later. But in his previous book, Radical Pedagogy, the issue that he dealt with was the question of our teaching practices. What is it that we do which can be destructive? What is it that we need to do so that we do less harm to our students? In the essay that he contributed to my collection, he's answering this question, the question of literature having the capacity to produce empathy amongst our students and in ourselves. And he gives you a couple of examples of why technically it doesn't do it automatically. He gives you the example of a Nazi camp commandant, right, who would watch operas put together by the Jewish inmates of the camp, and he will cry over an opera, right? But at the same time, he was running a death camp. There is another example that someone else quotes of a rich lady, who is sitting in theater and crying over what's happening to the characters while her servants wait outside in the rain, right? So the point of these examples is that even when you feel empathy for the characters in a play or characters in an opera or in a novel, that doesn't automatically translate to the people in real world who might be from the same constituency, right? So what Mark Brocker is arguing here is in opposition to Martha Nussbaum's work and her claims that literature can teach compassion because it triggers certain things in people when they read them. And Mark's main question is, well, yes, it can do that, but no one is trying to explain how, right? Because we already know that it's not automatic, right? So that means we need to come up with a certain kind of pedagogy. If we are practitioners of humanities, if we teach it at any level, from elementary school up to college, university level, we need to develop modes of teaching that can encourage empathy, not just for characters in a book, but that they transport it to real life too. Now, obviously, if you believe as an academic or teacher that that is not your job, your job is to teach content, right? Then this will not convince you, right? And we are encouraged to be that deliverers of content, right? Because it's easier to do that. Just master these things. And there is a wonderful critique of that in Mark Proctor's book that I mentioned, Radical Pedagogy. So before I go on, let me see if there are any questions. Cool. So yeah, here, for example, literature in true sense humanizes use. And good point. The point is, does it do it by itself? Right? If you just read a good book, maybe it will have an impact on you, and we'll go into it later. But by and large, um, it will do that only if coupled with informed pedagogy, right? Or if we are trained to read a novel and then go beyond it. By itself, it will not do that. It actually sometimes would concretize your stereotypes. Let's assume you're an uncritical reader and you read a novel in which a certain group of people are represented as lazy and violent. So what then it will end up doing for you is concretizing that prejudice if you don't have the capacity to read the actions of those characters within the logic of the power structure in which they exist. And two, beyond that, if you have not been trained or educated to take that sympathy that develops for a character who's being beaten or who's being abused and then take it in your real life conduct. For that, we need a certain informed pedagogy. Now, what Brocker teaches us that there are different ways in which we interact with the text, right? So we bring to a text certain presuppositions, right? And what he calls that our approach to the text is not just me going in, it's also the mental schemas, the schemas of my consciousness play a role in my interaction with the text, right? Now, if I read a text and it invokes empathy or sympathy for a character in the novel, I will not take it to my real life situation unless the schemas upon which my view of the world is built are altered and shifted, right? How do we do that in a literature classroom? That's the question, right? A lot of teachers have this philosophy that we are going to break our students and remake them, right? And that works good on paper, but actually it does a lot of harm. And here's why it does a lot of harm is because when students walk into our classes, you and me as well, when we walk into our classes, and this also comes from Mark Brocker, one of our biggest social needs always psychologically is to protect our identity. Whatever we think we are naturally geared towards protecting it. That's why, if you know, when you enter a new space, you feel anxiety, even if there is no threat, because your body tells you this is a new place. I'm not sure what my place is in this place. Exactly that's how when the students walk into our class, their main concern in that class is to protect their identity. And they are putting a lot of energies into that experience, just keeping their identity stable, whatever they believe they are. I'm a Democrat, I'm gay, I'm lesbian, I'm Pakistani, I'm Indian. Those are parts of their identity. And what they are perceiving in the environment that you have created as a teacher is the threats to that identity. Now, what could be a threat? One could be your blatant disregard of who they are. That would immediately impact them. Other could be some microaggressions, things you say about women, things you say about brown people, black people. Those are direct aggressions. But it could also be the content. The content can be threatening, right? So what happens is when their identities are threatened, right, the students, instead of opening up, since the basic instinct is to protect your own identity, they close you off. And so you're never going to reach them. You're never going to change their mind because their energies are being spent on protecting their identity. Now, they will perform the work, right? And write your papers and get their A and move on, but it's not going to shift the schemas upon which their identity is built, right? And the question is, for literature to be able to do that, then our pedagogy needs to know that the students are entering our classes with precarious identities, right? They have religious identities. They have their own views of whatever politics they live in. How then to introduce them to radical material without bringing their identity in crisis? And that's where, according to earlier research of Mark Brocker, sentimental literature can play a role, like novels like Uncle Tom's Cabin, right? Life in the Iron Mills, sentimental poetry, because what it does is it impacts the emotions, right? But beyond that, what do we do? So what we need to do then beyond that, first of all, create an environment of open class discussions, respecting your students' opinions, not forcing upon them what you obviously think makes them uncomfortable. So that whole idea that we break our students and remold them, that's a really destructive idea. So work with what they have. But also in the process, let them enhance their identities. Now, literature can do that, but in order to do that, we need to make literature work for us. So we can ask some really simple questions about the characters. A woman is being mistreated. What do we feel about it? Obviously, any living human being will say, yeah, this is bad. It won't matter what her race, what her sexuality is, right? Now, what you have done is you have invoked the performative empathy of a person. And I had a wonderful conversation about Mark about this about 10 years ago, because I was talking to his undergraduate students and I asked them how the class was going. And they were like, well, you know, he asks us these questions, and by the second week, we know which question to give him. And that's what we do. And I told Mark, look, your students are already anticipating the kind of answer you want. And his point was, well, that is the point. If they are performing an empathetic identity for the sake of the class, they are already performing empathy, right? It's already shifting their schemas, right? So getting the students engaged by questions that do not threaten them, also what he points out here, that you take, so what else are our opinions of others formed of is what he calls the prototypes. Now, prototypes are kind of a stereotype, concretized, where when we see a certain group or a certain people, that prototype immediately launches in our minds and we already have an opinion of that group, right? Now, in order to change a person's views, let's say about Muslims, about African Americans, about gays and lesbians, what we have to change is that prototype, right? Because unless that is changed, that person's views about those people or that constituency will not change. The way to do it then is to point within a novel to what Mark Brocker calls the commonalities that we might have, right? So if there are two human beings in the novel who are absolutely different from you, there must be something as a human being that you can point to and say, well, okay, don't I bleed when I hurt, right? Famous Shakespeare lines. Pointing to commonalities then eases the anxiety of the person interacting with the text, but then they also see that person or that constituency not as extremely different, but as someone with whom they might have something in common, a little thing here and there. And that is when the prototype that's invoked in their mind, or the archetype, whatever you want to call it, which is already pre-deciding for them how to view a certain group of people, will start reshaping itself by acknowledging the common humanity with a character in the novel and in the real life, right? So what we've learned so far is that teaching empathy to our students and learning it ourselves, it's not an accident. It doesn't happen through evolutionary means, and it certainly doesn't happen absolutely if we have read more books. It happens only when we perform a certain kind of reading, looking for certain things, and as teachers, when we teach a certain way. So I'm going to stop here and look at the questions and then continue. Okay, so here is literature is not something that can be applied as theory or something else. Literature lives within us, even though we are well, I don't know what that means. I don't know if literature lives within us. I know that love of beautiful things exists within us, but literature, I mean, to you, if you are living in Pakistan, literature, what you see in it, what you read in a poem is completely different from someone else living elsewhere, depending on the language and context. In Pakistan, where I am originally from, it's absolutely okay to quote sappy poems or very emotional or sentimental poems. You do that in American Academy, you're dead, because the way poetry is respected here is the kind of poetry that's not emotional, that's not sentimental. So maybe the desire to learn exists in us, and it can be anything: desire to make shoes, desire to make buildings, desire to write. But to assume that we are by our nature literary beings, it's unconvincing to me. But the idea that literature doesn't need a theory, it absolutely needs a theory. We're talking about literary pedagogy. We're talking how to teach literature and then how to read it. If we don't have the right tools to read it, first of all, the language, then the subtleties of language, then the history of that language, how do the allusions work? This is just the technical detail. But if we are going to mobilize humanities and literature for our students to make sure that they become compassionate, empathetic beings in this world, then we need more than just them reading the books. And the research already proves that just reading the books doesn't make you a better person. And actually, I am on record on this. You don't need to read at all to be a good person, right? How many people do you know from your life who can't even read and write, can't quote Shakespeare or Ghalib or Faz Ahmad Faz, but they are wonderful, empathetic human beings, right? The reason I am talking about literature and empathy is because that is what we do, right? We are scholars and teachers of literature. Two, majority of the young people, at least where I live, come to college to get a degree. Three, majority of them take literature and humanities courses. So probably this is the only place where they will encounter texts from other parts of the world, where they will encounter ways of thinking from other parts of the world. Now, the question for us as teachers and students of literature is, can we use that experience for them to make them see the world more compassionately, instead of internalizing the logic of the business school, where all they're teaching is that the profit margin is what decides your success, and how you get there, as long as it is legal, is fine, right? How do we teach a business student that while it may be okay for a big business to come into a small neighborhood and drive small businesses out of business and build a huge mall, which makes absolute perfect sense in capitalism, but that it could be ethically wrong, right? By displacing so many people. That difference only the humanistic education can teach us. And then, how do we teach our students that if they are successful and doing great in life, right? It doesn't mean that those who are not successful and those who are not doing great in life and who are poor are lazy and don't know how to do things. That is what we are talking about. And that, in my view, happens in humanities classrooms. Good. So yeah, literature teaches empathy. The question is, do you feel empathy while you are watching a play? Of course, we feel for the characters. We watch a movie, we feel for the characters. But when we get out of the movie theater, right, does it change the way we see the world? That's the question. So the research on consciousness tells you is that people can feel empathy, compassion for characters in a play. There is no denying that fact, or in a movie. But does it transport into their real life actions? That's the question, right? And the research on consciousness tells you no, not automatically, right? But if we teach a text a certain way where not only are they feeling empathy for the characters in a book, but they also see them as fully equal human beings with certain common traits, and then continue talking about it over a semester and all, then they will start performing that empathetic identity in the world as well. And the reason isn't that the literature convinced them. The reason is that the schemas that shaped their identity would have shifted, would have become larger to encompass in it this love of the other, this care of the other, respect for the other, and compassion for them. That is when literature has the capability of creating empathy. Okay, I have another question from Ishan Mukherjee. So if empathy enables us to be more respectful towards communities at a micro level, does that automatically shift? It's a really good question. Think of it this way. I mean, in so many ways, the macro level and micro level are interconnected. So much of what we are is overdetermined by the larger structures within which we exist, right? But so much of that macro structure depends on individual actions here and there. I would not say that, like, if you and me and everyone else starts being empathetic, it will change the system. But at the end of the day, given the over-determining factors of the lives that we live in, right? What options do we have, right? We cannot change the world. We know that. We cannot even challenge the systems within which we exist. So the first step is to always think critically of the system in which we exist. But beyond that, the next step is to change our own behaviors, right? We cannot change our own behaviors if we don't think of our own life critically, acknowledge our own privilege, our own power, right? And then keep asking ourselves, like, how am I interacting with other people? How am I responding to other people? So at that micro level, if you can change your behavior, I can change my behavior, right? Maybe it will impact a few other people, right? But in order for the whole system to change, I'm just doing recently, I started doing a lecture series on Paulo Freire. You can watch that as well. And that is the question he's asking, right? Is how do we change the system and make it a more compassionate and just system, right? And his answer to that is education, right? And education that is led by the lived experiences of the oppressed, right? Of the people who may not have a say in it. Now, that happens only when the so-called organic intellectuals of Antonio Gramsci, right, when they work with the people, learn from them. So to have that kind of macro level change, we will require a movement, right? And a group of people who are willing to do that. The reason it applies to literature departments and our teaching is that if we can convince more and more professors and teachers to think of this thing, to think of this idea that we don't just teach content, we also teach habits of critical thought, but we also teach our students to look at the characters in a novel who may be completely different from them, but look for similarities, right? So that they can empathize with them. And then, in the process of doing that, hope that when they learn to empathize with characters and answers questions about them and question their own empathy, that will shift the mental schemas upon which the edifice of their self is built. And then they take that changed self outside into the world. Now, the reason I'm emphasizing the pedagogical part of it is because that is what I do, right? I teach at a university and I teach humanities. That's why literature. Now, if you're not a professor, if you're out there in the world, of course you can apply the same principles to your workplace. If you're training some people to be workers in a corporation, if you're training someone to be a tech expert, right? This applies to them as well too, right? I mean, if you are a tech person and you are helping someone on the phone, right, your first tendency is probably to assume, oh, this is another English professor. How do I tell these stupid people how to fix their problems, right? But we can teach them, put yourself in the shoes of this person. This person is trying to do something on the internet. His computer is not working, and now try to help them. Now that's we teaching a person working in the marketplace. And we do that. All businesses do that here. I mean, how do they teach them how to be good, effective, service providers? By anticipating the needs of others, right? Now, that is the surprising thing, is that the corporate sector knows that the profit is in handling their diverse customer base better. So they train their people to anticipate the needs of their customers and to at least come across as sympathetic, listening, patient, right? That's exactly what we are trying to do in a literature classroom on a larger scale, right? And seeing if the literature has the capacity to do that. Okay, did I miss anyone's question? Is there any examples from literature? Yes, so Mandeep, okay, so let me choose an example from the American context, right? There is of course, Uncle Tom's Cabin is one of the most highly anthologized novels in the world, right? Now, in 1980s, when standpoint theories of identity were prominent, right? When women, African American feminists, basically were saying, you have been trying to explain the world from point of view of the men, from point of view of the privileged Caucasian population. You cannot speak for me, right? So Uncle Tom's Cabin was challenged from the African American community because, and Uncle Tom is a derogatory word in African American community even now, because what is the story? Here is a slave, who loves his master, right? Who's a wisdom figure, and he dies, a Christian praising his master. What's there to be proud of for 1970s African Americans who, were trying to say, we are not Uncle Toms, we are not sellouts, we are individuals capable of taking care of ourselves and our own communities. But why was the novel so effective in its own time? Because it did convince a lot of people to not like slavery anymore and to actually actively get engaged in ending slavery. The reason was that it was a sentimental novel. And despite the fact that Uncle Tom dies as a slave praising his master, what the novel does brilliantly is convinces a reader that regardless of his status as a slave, Uncle Tom and his family and all the other African Americans with them are fully realized Christian human beings with feelings, who feel a sense of loss, who feel joy, who can be sympathetic, who can be hardworking. So what it does for white audiences in its time is it humanizes the slaves. It shows them as human beings who suffer, human beings who are capable, who are smart, intelligent, compassionate, right? So in that sense, then, what the novel offered to white readers was a completely opposite constituency, that of the Southern slaves, right? But then gave them ample instances in there where they could see the slaves, Uncle Tom and others, and wonder, oh, they go to church, they sing in their church. He loves Jesus, right? So, first of all, they're seeing them as fellow Christians. Then they're seeing, oh, they when they lose someone, they die. When they can be happy, they can be they can be charitable, right? All of these are human attributes that they previously might have attributed to their own race, and suddenly the novel shows them this wide range of commonality, right? And because of that, then in the act of reading, while they are feeling that sympathy for them, that commonality then overwrites their schemas of not understanding or deriding, or that prototype of Africans that existed in their minds. So that's an example, for example, from the American context. Now, if you want to look at something, let's say from the Indian context, just pick up any novel that does that. For example, the famous novels Coolie and others, right, which tell the plights of the people in a different caste structure, right? It doesn't change the politics, but it gives the life of a person one day in the life of a person who is from a lower caste, right? And maybe someone reading it then can see this person as a fellow human being. So that's the capacity of literature. But so the sentimental novels then do invoke our empathy and sympathy, right? The question is, can we see then within that some form of commonality or common humanity? And if we experience it over and over, Mark Bracker's argument is that that would then broaden the archetype or the prototype or the stereotype which shapes our perceptions of others. And only then would this experience transport into real life actions. Okay, so how can literature teach empathy in a country where colonial baggage of appropriating language does not allow a large number of masses to read and understand literature? That's a very good point. But I mean, you have a school system, right? And you have government schools and private schools. The colonials left 70 years ago. They are no longer telling you this is how you ought to teach our children. You have your own higher education department. You have your experts. I know pretty much the Pakistani educational system. It's a tiered system. The government schools are impoverished. The private schools still privilege, the anglicized education. That's a question of choice by your culture and by your middle class elite. I am a post-colonialist. I will never condone anything that the colonizers did. But I am also for, okay, fine. They left. They ruined our cultures. But what have we done to make our cultures better? Have we come up with curricula that teaches other than, false history and emotional attitudes to others? Does Pakistan have a curriculum which includes within it, respect for minorities, respect for women? If it has that, then good teachers can mobilize them to teach respect. So generally, it's easier, I guess, to blame the colonizers. It's my job as a post-colonialist to do that. But the question is, what has our native elite done? Have they developed research in humanities and in, education that says, here is how to teach love and kindness to kid in rural Sindh, in Balochistan, right? In KPK, in Punjab. Here is what we need to train our teachers, right? So If the nation hasn't done that, and if they have privatized higher education, then it's an industry, right? And yeah, we can blame Americans and we can blame the British as much as we want, but at the end of the day, if we ourselves are not investing in education and we are just not training ourselves to do things differently, then I mean, let's take some responsibility for ourselves as well. So I mean, look at the PhD programs in Pakistan. What are they offering, right? What kind of resources do they give their students? What kind of mentoring is there? And are they really training them to be good scholars? Or are the universities geared towards actually being research universities, right? These are the questions that you, me, and everyone else should be asking. Same applies to India, right? And Bangladesh, all these regions that I deal with. To be very honest, you know, um, there is a colonial heritage because they left an elite in our countries. That elite still has internalized the logic of that colonial system. But there is also a vast majority of people in all these countries who are educated, who are critical, right? And who are constantly developing strategy to undo the project of capital and to undo the experience of colonialism. Critiquing it is absolutely necessary. I do that all the time. Making it a reason for our own failures, I disagree with. I think, I think given the right kind of attitude at the national level, on the level of individuals and professors of literature, if they are curious enough to learn what they do in the classes, we can make a huge difference. Now, think of it this way, if those of you who teach, what is expected of us in a college classroom? If students are supposed to take centralized exams, then we are just doing exam prep. Now, that's a colonial leftover, right? If the students are expected to write critically and engage with real life issues, that would require a different kind of pedagogy, right? So this idea of literature teaching empathy already presupposes that we are in a classroom where our emphasis is not on just teaching, here are 5 plays of Shakespeare you need to know, and here is how you need to think about them, right? We need to be in a classroom where we are actually encouraging critical thinking. But within that, even in content delivery, if they are preparing for a test, is still an opportunity for us to teach them about their local others, right? How do they think of women if they are men? How do they think of minorities around them, right? And then include in our classes texts, local or global, where minorities are treated respectfully, where they are treated as equals and not as inferiors. So, first, we have an example in a text where that is happening. And then, when we talk about it and make them think about it critically, maybe they'll walk out of that class thinking, this is how I ought to treat someone who's not from my dominant group. These are just some of my thoughts. Okay. So, as I said, literature by itself cannot do that. Okay, and there is research on it. Literature read carefully with an idea of learning from it and changing our behavior, or taught with that in mind, absolutely can create an empathetic self, can teach empathy. And the reason that will happen is because, according to Mark Bracker and other scholars and who have studied human consciousness, because it will enable us to shift the mental schemas upon which our identity is built. Now, I have a full explanation of it, and I'll put it up there in my lecture on Mark Bracker. But the general idea is that our identity relies on certain things to stabilize us or for its formation. And one of that is what is called the self-serving scripts. And that is the linguistic register in which we stabilize our identity. And within that, there are certain narratives or stories that we internalize. These stories rely on certain archetypes, certain prototypes, right? So if you have internalized an origin story in which men are superior to women, right? Men are smarter than women, then that's your self-serving narrative. If you walk into my class and I tell you women are superior to men or women are equal, that stabilizing register comes into crisis. Now, my job as a teacher is that by using the text and stories in it, convincing you to, first of all, feel empathy for the female characters, see them as your equals, see them as rational beings capable of thought and sometimes capable of better thought. And when you have experienced that in a text, my hope is that in the process of experiencing that, reading that, repeating that, that's what you brought, your self-serving narrative has been broadened. And when that has been broadened, it cannot be undone. It can only be undone when someone's intellectual horizon has been broadened. It can only be undone through some kind of involvement with metaphysics and religion, because those are the only powers that tell you, no, what you have been thinking is wrong. This is what God wants you to believe. Women are inferior. So these are some of my thoughts on this topic, and hope you all have had some insights. And now, if you want anything to share, let me go through the questions. While I do that, if you have any questions, I will be happy to answer that. Good. So yeah, here is another good point. Let me bring it up. As one feels and understands what another person is feeling or experiencing from within the frame of reference, we can say by place. Absolutely. That's exactly what we mean by empathy, right? And that we place ourselves within the framework from where the other person is speaking. And think of it this way. No one needs to teach us that. Even when we are little children, we know that if the other person places them within our framework, they will understand us better. So when we were little, how many times did we tell our parents, no, 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 no. You're not looking at it from my point of view. So what we meant for them was that if you look at it from my point of view, you will understand it better. But two, you will always also be sympathetic to my point of view. Another example from our real life says sometimes we say, if he knew me better, he wouldn't treat me like that, right? So what we are implying in that statement is that I am a decent human being. And the reason this person is treating me like that is because he doesn't know that. And if he knew it, maybe he will treat me better, which also then teaches us that our idea is that if we are decent human beings, other people will treat us better, right? So we have already internalized that if we are good people, we are likely to be respected more, but also this rough idea that we forgive others when they are rude to us because what we are saying is, well, he doesn't know me. The point of empathy is in a humanities classroom and in life is to do that without knowing another person, right? To be kind and generous to strangers, right? That is what we are trying to teach, that you don't need to know me, who I am, what I believe in, what my politics is, to look at me and say, how can I help you? That's what will then be empathy, this natural response to the plight of the other with an aim to help them. Okay, so Asfa, I would do a separate one on transculturalism and transnationalism, not today, but do please remind me and we can have a whole conversation about it. I must admit that transculturalism as theory goes is not my expertise, But transnationalism and cosmopolitanism, I can absolutely talk about. So maybe we will decide a whole, weekly webinar on it. Thank you. Someone is posting, I don't know, like someone is posting spam here. So sorry, we can't really get rid of things like that. All right, any other questions? We are already at 50 minutes. So, okay, this is now almost a regular feature. I will come on every Saturday unless there is something going on that I can't make it, and I'll announce that. I will come on every Saturday at 10 o'clock my time, and the announcements will be made a week in advance. Please also support our channel, by actually going there, watching some videos, commenting on them, sending me your questions. That really encourages me when I see a question there or a comment, because you all are over there. I am here, and it is really a good thing for me. So I have another suggestion to conduct a session on diaspora. Absolutely, we can plan that. I'll put it on my list, and then I can plan it down the road. So we already have one on cosmopolitanism and transnationalism, with a little bit of transculturalism thrown in, and then we plan one on diaspora. It will most probably be on diaspora writing, but absolutely, and the political role of diaspora here in the metropolitan cultures. So I'll put those on the list too. Okay, that's all I have today. Thank you so much for joining me. And as I said, please feel free to send me your suggestions and any other questions that you might have, and I will stay in touch with you, and I'll come back next week and we will decide the topic. Maybe let's announce it here. We will talk about cosmopolitanism and literature, and that next Saturday. So that's all I have. Thank you so much, and thank you for joining me. And you all have a wonderful day and evening wherever you are. I will post the edited version of this on the channel by tonight. Thank you. Goodbye, and peace and love.